Alright, so this is week 5, Introduction to CSS. So what we'll cover today is a few things. We'll try to get you guys all set up and linked to an external style sheet. I'll sort of start with an introduction to what CSS is and what it does. And then we'll just play around. We'll look at some CSS syntax and we'll play around with some styling some elements in our current HTML pages. Alright, so that's the plan for today. Real quickly, what I want to do is kind of just reiterate exactly what CSS does, right? So we talked about previously over and over again that authoring things on the web is different than authoring things in Microsoft Word, for example. So in Word, we typically author things using writing out the content and styling or designing that content simultaneously. And as you've learned in the last 4 weeks, that's not how we do it for the web. So when we create things in HTML, we're just marking up the content, and the content is displayed on the page sort of as a default or in a default sort of visual display. So again, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So if I remove all of the styles from my portfolio page, you'll see it looks actually quite similar to the pages that you've already created in Lab, right? So you'll see some lists, some headings, some images, and things like that, right? And some links and things like that. So this is how your HTML page should look, and when you actually start to implement some CSS, you can start to do things, right? So you can start to move things around, change fonts, change colors, change background, change things like layout. So layout's really important, right? So instead of one long column, I've made this 3 columns. And so all of those kinds of things, very important sort of design decisions are controlled through CSS. So real quickly, just to define some things, CSS literally stands for, let me make that bigger for you. Sorry about that. CSS literally stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And we'll talk about what that cascading means in Cascading Style Sheets in a subsequent video and in a subsequent lab session. But right now we just want to sort of talk about exactly how to implement it and how to get started with CSS in this video. So there are a couple things you need to know about the syntax of CSS. So syntax is just the structure of the language. Just like HTML has its own syntax, so HTML uses these brackets and these closing brackets for certain tags. The syntax for CSS is a little bit different. And so there's 3 major elements in CSS. There is the Css Selector, which is element 1. There is the property, which is element 2, and then there's the value, which is property 3. So those are the 3, or the element 3. So those are the 3 major elements in the syntax of CSS. The CSS selector, the property, and the value. So let me just walk you through an example of that. This might not make a whole lot of sense to you, but by the end of this video, hopefully you'll get some context for what I'm talking about. So the CSS selector is literally selecting the tag from HTML that you want to change, okay, that you want to add some design to. And so the reason why we have tags, and I've talked about this previously, I've talked about this in class, they don't do anything magical. They just describe the content we're marking up, right? So the H1, there's nothing magical about the H1. We're just saying this is a header 1. So we're describing this content as header 1. So the reason why those tags exist is that we can then make some changes visually to those particular tags. And so what CSS allows us to do is we can make any change to any tag in any HTML document, right? So an example of a CSS selector would be literally just the tag, right? So H1. I want that to be lowercase. I'm going to open this up in Text Wrangler. And let's make this bigger. Okay, so H1, that's an example of a selector. We're just selecting the tag that we want to manipulate. So any tag, P could be a selector, nav could be a selector, H2 could be a selector, right? So those are all examples of selectors. So that's the first sort of piece of syntax that you need to learn. In CSS, after we open a selector, we place a space and then we use this curly bracket. Okay, and so it's kind of similar to the caret in HTML in that when you open a curly bracket, you've got to close a curly bracket. So we've opened a curly bracket and we're closing a curly bracket. So inside of these brackets is where we put our properties and values. And so properties and values are things that, like tags, that you won't necessarily have to memorize, but you'll sort of internalize these as you begin to use CSS more and more. But for a comprehensive list of properties and values, you can go to W3 Schools, and there's a list of properties and values. So let me just quickly define a property. So a property is just some kind of characteristic of that selected tag that you want to change. So you could change, for example, the font family, right? So we want to change from Times New Roman to Arial or something. Okay, so that's an example of a property, font family. And then the example of the value is the actual thing you want to change, right? So we want to change the font family to Arial. Okay, so there's a couple of things I want to point out, right? This is an example of one full CSS declaration. Okay, so we've got our selector, our H1, we've got our property, font family, and we've got our value Arial. Another thing to note is you can add as many or as little properties to one single tag, right? So we don't want to just change it to Arial. We also want to change the font size to 14 pixels. Okay, so you can go on ad nauseum with however many properties you want to assign to a single element. So there's a few things I'll point out in terms of just the structure. After every property, you've got to have a colon. So you see that there. And then after every value, property and value, you separate properties and values using semicolons. Okay? So I'll just say that one more time. After the property, you have a colon. After your property and value line, you have a semicolon to separate properties and values. Okay, so those are the three essential pieces of CSS. Let's go into and just quickly take a look at our HTML documents that we have from last week. So what we have here is from week 4 an HTML document that looks like, let's open it up, this. Okay, we've got our logo, we've got sort of a nav bar going on, and 3 sections of content. Okay, so what we want to do, the first thing we need to do is we need to, and let me blow this text up a little for you. All right, so let's make this a little bigger. The first thing we need to do is connect a CSS document to our existing HTML document. So we go into our HTML document, and this is what our HTML document looks like. One place that we need to connect it, or the only place we need to connect it, is inside of the head tag here. Okay, so after your title, we're going to add a link to a CSS file. Okay, So there's a few properties that a link tag must have, and the first is what's called rel, which stands for relative or relationship, right? So relationship to the current document is a style sheet. Okay. The other thing we need to include in our style sheet link is type, and let me just make sure I'm getting this correct. Text/CSS. So the type of file we're linking to is text/CSS, and then most importantly we need the actual hypertext reference. So I'm going to call this lab.css. You can call this file whatever you want, right? And this is not a self-closing tag. You can call this file whatever you want, right? So you could call this my portfolio.css, portfolio.css, whatever you want to call it. I'm just calling it lab.css. Okay. So this is what makes the connection. This is a magical piece of code right here. This is what makes the connection from this HTML sheet that I'm working on, this page here, to a separate file that you'll open in Notepad++ or Text Wrangler or whatever, that's a CSS file. Okay, so this is what makes that link. So what we have to do then is we would have to actually make sure we have a file called lab.css, right? And as we've talked about absolute and relative linking, we want that to be included in the exact same folder where all of the rest of our HTML files are. So I'm going to create a file called lab.css, as you see up here, and I'm going to save it in the folder where all of my HTML files are. Okay, so now I've created lab.css. Right, so now you've got two separate documents opened up in your text editor. One is your HTML document, and the other is your CSS document. So it's important to know that. Right, so right off the bat, let's make a change that's sort of really drastic so you can see it being changed on the HTML page. So let's change this to 36 pixels. So we're going to make the first level headers in our document huge, right? So let's find our first level headers. We just have one here called resume. Okay, so the word resume should be really huge when we update our page. And let's see. So let's open, and you can see it's pretty huge. It's resume. And actually that's not that different. Let's make it even bigger just to show you that our HTML and CSS pages are connected. So let's make this 75 pixels and just make it huge. Oops. And did I save this? Make sure you're saving. And let's make sure we are updating. Yeah, there it is. And now you can see that resume is really huge. Right now it's 75 pixels. Okay, so you can see that that's one good way to just sort of see, are these two files connected? Is my HTML file connected to my CSS file? And indeed, our HTML file is connected to our CSS file. So really, that's all I want you to get out of this. Let's play around a little bit with some of the other elements, and you can play around in class and things like that. And so let's just make a change to a few things that would be interesting to you. So we created a nav here, and someone in class had mentioned wanting to know how to make this a horizontal nav. There's a couple things we can do, and I'll show you exactly how to do that. So the first thing we have to do in CSS, so in a CSS file you can include as many selectors or as little selectors as you want. So one thing we want to do is we want to select nav, right? So we want to make a change to our nav. We want to make this stuff horizontal instead of vertical. So to do that, we want to make a change to it to nav. And specifically, we want to make a change to the way that the list items are displayed, right? So the way that the LIs are displayed. So right now the list items are displayed vertically, and we want to make them horizontal. So how would we do that? So if we just Googled how to make list horizontal in CSS, I'm sure we would find something. And so the first link you see, and let me blow this up a little, is Css Navigation Bar, right? And so it's got a list of links, and there's a couple things we can do. We can look to horizontal navigation bar, and we can see, oh look, we can use the property display and the value inline for list items. So let's take a look at what that might look like. Let's jump back to our CSS page. So we've opened up or selected our navigation. Okay, so the reason why we've selected navigation and not just list items is that we have other list items in our HTML document, right? So we've got one here, 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 here. So since we have a bunch of other list items, we don't want to make the change to all list items. We only want to make the change to list items inside of navigation, right? And so this is where this cascading part of cascading style sheets comes from. So we want to make a change to list items only in our navigation bar. And so the way that we read or sort of translate the syntax of CSS is we read from right to left, actually. So we go all list items. I want to make a change to all list items inside of all unordered lists inside of the nav. Okay, so I'm going to say that again because this will be important. We're going to make a change to all list items inside of all unordered lists inside of nav. Okay, so we're just selecting these 4 list items. So that's what CSS allows us to do, is it allows us to select specific elements. And so we remember the property was display and the value was inline. So let's save that and let's open up week 5 HTML again. And you can see at the top here, our list is now inline, or our navigation bar is now horizontal. Okay, so let's see what would happen if we just said all list items and we didn't specify inside of the nav. Okay, so if we said all list items display inline, you'll see that all of the lists are now horizontal. There's no like normal looking bulleted lists anymore, right? They're all horizontal. So we don't want that. We would want just our navigation bar, right? So again, we want to select all list items inside of all unordered lists inside of our navigation bar. We just want to display inline. We want to make horizontal. Let's make a change now to other list items. Okay, so in other list items, one thing we can do is we can make this, like, change the spacing. We can change the spacing between bulleted list items. So we're going to we'll select all list items, and we'll just say, so how do you actually make spacing in between lines of text? We use what's called margins. Okay, so let's say margin top is our property, and our value is 10 pixels. So basically what we're saying is, in between each list item, we're going to add 10 pixels at the top of each list item. So it'll add 10 pixels of space in between each list item. So let's just take a look at what that looks like. Okay, and so you can see each of these has more space in between these list items now, right? So we can control things like what kind of font we're using, the size of the font, but we can also control things like spacing, right? So like how much space in between list items. And just to make that more pronounced, if you change this to like 100 and saved it, you would see like 100 pixels of space between each list item. Okay, so those are just some examples of some things you can do. Really, the most important thing that I want you to get out of this video um, is the main syntax of CSS, which is our selector, which is simply the tag that you're selecting, our property, which are things like font family, font size, and our value, things like Arial and the actual value. Okay, so those are the main things I want you to get out of it. The other thing that you'll start to think about more and we'll actually implement next week is this idea of selecting specific items, right? So like we made just our navigation bar horizontal. We're going to want to do that for other items in our HTML pages, right? So like we'll want certain paragraphs to look a certain way, and we'll want certain headers or H2s to look a certain way. And to do that, we'll have to implement new tags, and we talked about this in class a few class periods ago. But we'll implement new tags, and we'll implement different structures to allow us to pinpoint specific items for us to make changes with. All right, so that's all we have for today. Feel free to play around as much or as little as you want. And that is Introduction to CSS.